Hey everybody, this is chapter 5 of Peter Drucker's Max Shachtman is Left. Chapter 5 is titled The Third Camp. On the 7th of December 1941, the Japanese attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Within hours, the United States was at war not only with Japan but with Germany and Italy. The country's months of waiting and preparation were over. So was the Workers' Party's initial breathing spell. Now Shachtman's ideas of a third camp that would be a protagonist and possible victor in the war would be tested in his own country. Looking back, most people would find Shachtman's decision to support a, quote, third camp, end quote, instead of his country's war effort unbelievable. Shachtman did not equate Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan with the democratic United States. Shachtman knew how much worse a fascist or dictatorial government was to live under than a capitalist democracy. Shachtman had made the distinction at length in the early 1930s, when Shachtman urged German communists to join with Social Democrats to oppose the Nazis. Shachtman and his followers hoped fervently for the Axis' defeat, but he believed that the best hope for democracy and lasting peace after the Second World War would be movements independent of the Allied governments. Nothing about the U.S. entry into the war raised any hesitation in the Workers' Party about opposing it. Shachtman had convinced his followers that U.S. rulers were fighting for world supremacy, for example, by taking advantage of Britain's fight for survival to push it aside as a world power. U.S. corporations were grabbing British markets in Latin America. They had virtually transferred Canada and Australia from one empire to the other, already a power shift Shachtman had seen coming as early as 1926. Quote, England is more at America's mercy than it is at Germany's, end quote, he said, which showed, quote, the fraudulence of all claims that this is a war for democracy, end quote. Despite widespread indignation about the Japanese attack and Japanese atrocities, the U.S. war in the Pacific reinforced Shachtman's conviction that the Second World War had little to do with fighting fascism. The government ground out propaganda against the, quote, yellow peril, end quote, and in turn tens of thousands of U.S. citizens of Japanese descent in the name of defending democracy. The first U.S. battles against Japan were fought to defend U.S. rule in the Philippines, while the British fought to defend their rule in Malaya, Burma, and India. The war against Japan, far from being democratic, was, quote, racially chauvinistic in the authentic Nazi style, end quote, Shachtman said. From India to the Philippines, Asia was the scene of, quote, an orgy of the imperialist swine, end quote. In the United States, the war was an orgy of arms profiteers who were resisted by working people in North America as the colonial powers were being resisted in Asia. Even in the months before Pearl Harbor, when the country was in a fever of fear and, quote, preparedness, end quote, Shachtman predicted radicalization ahead. In 1942 to 43, the radicalization began. Despite rising wages and high employment, workers grew more and more restive under the CIO's wartime no-strike pledge, which held them back while military contractors reaped record profits. The Workers' Party, prepared by a determined force to put its members in industrial unions, began to win influence and recruits among militant unionists. At the height of war production, the Workers' Party had 80% of its members in industry. The Workers' Party had strong presences, not thousands but dozens, in International Harvesters in Chicago, Lackawanna Steel in Buffalo, Ford Instrument in New York, and the Los Angeles and Philadelphia shipyards. Their group began its life with about 400 members, half the size of the pre-split Socialist Workers Party. It grew during the war to about 500. Shachtman's followers found a more receptive audience in the unions they joined than they had initially expected. The war was by no means universally popular among working people in the United States. Most saw it as unavoidable, but they were not necessarily enthusiastic about it or ready to make all the sacrifices that were demanded of them. Battles by which unionists and radicals had secured basic freedoms of speech and assembly from a hostile government were still fresh in many people's memories. Whatever the U.S. government was fighting for, some suspected it was probably not democracy, not when it banned publications like Labor Action from the mails. Yet the government could not stop Workers' Party members from passing Labor Action and its anti-war message from one sympathizer to the next, even in army camps. The Workers' Party's greatest success in the unions during the Second World War came in the United Auto Workers. Two factions had been fighting for control of this union, one of the CIO's most democratic since its foundation in the 1930s. Each faction had staked out a position at the heights of the union hierarchy. In the face of rank-and-file opposition to the no-strike pledge, both of the rival factions defended it. The Workers' Party helped catalyze the formation of a third faction, the rank-and-file caucus, based on Shachtman's analysis that the interests of union officials as a group tend inevitably to conflict with the interest of union members as a group. At the Auto Workers' September 1944 convention in Grand Rapids, Michigan, Shachtman, quote, his skills at their sharpest and his energies at their peak, end quote, helped convince the rank-and-file caucus to reject any compromise with either of the two dominant factions. The caucus succeeded in convincing 36% of the convention to vote for repudiating the no-strike pledge outright. It won a majority for a union-wide referendum on the issue. Shachtman, remembering what he now considered to be wasted opportunities in the mid-1930s, began in 1944 to look for ways to help the rank-and-file upsurge in the unions find independent political expression. Shachtman used the Workers' Party's influence to fight against Amalgamated Clothing Workers President Sidney Hillman's use of the powerful CIO Political Action Committee as an instrument in Roosevelt's 1944 re-election bid. The Workers' Party called instead for turning the Political Action Committee into an independent Labor Party. Shachtman fought against Hillman's effort to tie the American Labor Party of New York even more tightly to the Democratic Party. After failing to repeat his United Auto Workers' success and build an independent rank-and-file faction in the ALP, Shachtman backed David Dubinsky of the International Ladies Garment Workers against Hillman in order to keep a modicum of autonomy for the American Labor Party of New York. Shachtman's maneuvers within the U.S. labor movement fit into an international vision, a vision of the warring empire's common defeat by popular resistance movements independent of the U.S., British and Soviet governments. Looking back on Trotsky's 1940 prediction that Shachtman would surrender to the democracy's war drive, Shachtman said in 1942, quote, "We can afford even in these unpleasant days to smile," end quote. Far from giving in to patriotism, Shachtman and his organization turned out to be the war's staunchest opponents on the left. The New International said from the start that it would side with neither Britain nor Germany. Quote, "We say there is in this war a third camp, the camp of the world working class, cut off from all political control, inarticulate, brutally repressed when it raises its head, but ceaselessly in ferment, breaking through the surface to assert its human rights and needs. This is our camp, It means Czech students fighting the Gestapo in the streets of Prague, It means African natives going on strike in the Rhodesian copper mines, It means the Irish Revolutionary Army keeping green the traditions of the Easter Rebellion, It means Indian steel and textile and jute workers forcing concessions from the British Raj in militant strikes, It means the anti-conscription rioters in Australia, the millions of AFL and CIO rank-and-filers, the Polish peasants who seized the land when the landowners fled, before the coming of the Red Army, end quote. Shachtman's commitment to an independent working-class stance at home was bound up with his conviction that the war would create new revolutionary openings in Europe and Asia. Even before Pearl Harbor, Shachtman foresaw a, quote, revolutionary uprising, end quote, that would be born from the war in Europe. Quote, the growing restlessness and even guerrilla warfare in the occupied territories, particularly in Poland, Serbia, Norway, and France, contain the promise of mass popular and even revolutionary movements in the visible future, end quote, he said. He believed that these movements could bring peace and democracy to Europe. As Lenin welcomed the 1916 Irish Rebellion against Britain during the First World War, Shachtman looked for independent popular forces to emerge from the Second World War, forces that socialists could support and push in a revolutionary direction. Shachtman identified the most promising independent European forces in 1943 as the Yugoslav partisans under Josip Broz Tito and the Italians who rose up after Benito Mussolini's fall. In contrast to the French Gaullists, the Polish Home Army, and most of the communist-led resistance groups who fought as guerrilla auxiliaries of the Allied high commands, the Yugoslav and Italians initially struck Shachtman as genuinely independent forces. As 1943 gave way to 1944, and Allied troops advanced on every front, however, Shachtman lost hope that an independent force would actually manage to take power anywhere in Europe before the war ended. Shachtman foresaw instead a, quote, democratic interlude, end quote, in most of Europe, in which grassroots democratic forces emerging from resistance movements would fight for democratic constitutions and reforms without contending immediately for power. He urged European Marxists to join in post-war democratic movements for abolition of the Belgian and Italian monarchies, overthrow of Spanish and Greek dictatorships, a united independent democratic Germany, expropriation of companies that had collaborated with the Nazis, and colonial independence. Shachtman urged Trotskyists in France to support a socialist communist coalition government there, the better to defeat U.S.-backed right-wingers, expose socialist and communist timidity, and build a strong revolutionary socialist movement. In Eastern Europe, he predicted by 1943 that wartime anti-fascist movements would have to fight after the war for democracy against Stalinism. Before others on the left were ready to admit it, he saw that capitalism was being overthrown in Eastern Europe and communists were coming to power. He predicted that the regimes and economies being established there would be just as repressive and give as little power to working people as Stalin's regime in the Soviet Union. He did more. He developed a general theory of the Stalinist movement that explained both why communists could overthrow capitalism in Poland, when the Soviet army could be relied on to instill a pro-Soviet dictatorship, and why they would not overthrow capitalism in France, where a workers' revolution might ultimately threaten Soviet as well as U.S. power. Shachtman could feel with justice that his theory of bureaucratic collectivism had passed its biggest test yet with flying colors. In this discussion, he, quote, reached the peak of his intellectual powers, end quote. Revolutionary movements in Asia led Shachtman to hope for breakthroughs there, even after he had moderated his hopes for Europe. He did not hope for much from the Indian Congress Party or the Chinese Kuomintang. He criticized sharply and perceptively Chiang Kai-shek's subservience to the United States and Mohandas Gandhi's and Jawaharlal Nehru's failure to confront British rule decisively in India. But Shachtman admired the Viet Minh that Ho Chi Minh led against both Japan and France in Vietnam. Shachtman saw the Viet Minh as an independent force despite its communist leadership. As late as 1947, the Workers' Party picketed French consulates in solidarity with Viet Minh fighters the Viet Minh's fight for Vietnamese independence. Shachtman was also enthusiastic about the Indonesians who fought a war for independence from the Dutch in 1945-49. Although he was alive to the danger that independent Indonesia could come under U.S. hegemony. Although Shachtman was proud of the role of his Workers' Party played in the unions, U.S. politics, and solidarity movements, Shachtman developed a more clear-sighted modesty about his organizations as the war ended. It was not a, quote, party, end quote, in the full sense, Shachtman admitted, not an organization capable of leading U.S. workers in a revolution. It was a group educating working people about socialism, developing as an activist group putting socialist ideas into practice, and hoping to play an important role in forming a true revolutionary party. Shachtman wrote more about the kind of party he was working toward. Shachtman said that it had to be an, quote, all-inclusive revolutionary party, end quote, with room for diverse tendencies. At the same time, it needed a solid, quote, cadre, end quote, of member leaders who fully understood and agreed with the program it had decided on and who could defend, implement, and develop its program in the outside world. The Workers' Party's own cadre developed during the war only by fits and starts. The Workers' Party told its members to obey the draft law so that they would go where other working people went and not be isolated and ineffective in jails or conscientious objector camps. Given the group's low average age, it paid a high price for this policy. Quote, among those who went off were some of our ablest and most experienced men, our indispensables, and we know that not all of them will be returned to us, end quote. Shachtman said in 1945, quote, "It was an oppressive blow," end quote. The blow left Shachtman, Al Glotzer, and Ernest McKinney as the mainstays of the Workers' Party office, despite Shachtman's efforts to keep younger leaders around. When Labor Action editor Manny Geltman got his draft notice in 1943, Shachtman urged him to make sure that the draft board knew what a dangerous subversive he was, so that the Army, parenthesis, which surely didn't, quote, "want any goddamn Reds," end quote, and parenthesis, would keep him stationed on Governor's Island in New York Harbor. Somehow Shachtman expected Geltman to sneak away from Governor's Island to edit the newspaper at night. Geltman did his best, but an unmoved official told him, quote, "If the Attorney General wants you, he'll find you in the Army," end quote. Glotzer had to take over Geltman's job. Shachtman, chagrined, urged the same tactics on Glotzer when his draft call came. While Glotzer told the draft board he was a subversive, he was, quote, Max and McKinney, told the draft board what a subversive he was, quote, "Max and McKinney were sitting in the office waiting for me," end quote, he remembered. Quote, "They're down to me already. Only those two old cadres were not going to be called up," end quote. Glotzer escaped the draft not because of his politics, but because of his ulcers, a common complaint among Workers' Party leaders. Much of the burden of keeping the party going was taken by women. Women played a disproportionate role throughout the left during the war years, but especially in the Workers' Party. Glotzer remembered that Labor Action, quote, "would have an editorial meeting of 10 to 15 and every one of them was a woman," end quote. The group's male leaders took pride in the commitment and intelligence of their, quote, "magnificent female comrades," end quote. Footnote. Women are not encouraged to organize around their own issues, however. Shachtman had urged earlier for a, quote, "socialist women's movement, distinct and separate from the feminist and other bourgeois movements," end quote. But organizing a women's movement of any kind was low on his group's list of priorities. End footnote. The cadre of newly confident women and men returning from the Army faced a formidable challenge once the war was over. The evidence of heightened U.S. power was plainly visible. As the Workers' Party had predicted in 1943, the United States had given up isolationism for good. It had, quote, "acquired a power in world economics and politics that exceeds anything England ever possessed," end quote, Shachtman said. It was keeping, quote, "far-flung bases on the 7 seas and the 5 continents," end quote. It was creating world banks and trade agreements under its direction. Shachtman's few 100 followers were committed to continuing the fight against this colossus. Shachtman continued to pin his hopes on the Third Camp that had formed during the war. The opposition to U.S. predominance in Western Europe, anti-Stalinist movements in Eastern Europe, Vietnamese and Indonesian fighters for independence, and inside the United States, the newly militant union rank and file, poised for the biggest strike wave in U.S. history. In 1942-43, as the United States settled in for a long war, resistance grew in the unions to the sacrifices imposed on working people in the name of patriotism. Most of the left urged working people to resist less and sacrifice more. The Workers' Party stepped into the vacuum created by the default of virtually every other leftist organization to encourage and organize working people's assertive spirit. It played a role that parties with thousands of members could have envied. Shachtman believed that in the United States as in Europe, the Third Camp's fight was crucial not only to the future of socialism, but also to the future of democracy. Although most progressives in the United States were enthusiastic about the, quote, "war for democracy," end quote, Shachtman saw anti-democratic tendencies at work that would fuel post-war McCarthyism. To protect war industry, wages were being kept down. To keep wages down, the right to strike was curtailed. To insulate these decisions from political pressure, they were taken out of the political arena. The powers of the presidency were increased. More decisions were made by executive decree, fewer by debate and legislation. The decision to intern virtually all Japanese Americans was made with a stroke of a presidential pen. One man decided to drop the first 2 atomic bombs. The war ended without a peace treaty, so the post-war settlement was taken out of congressional hands. The, quote, national security state, end quote, was being born. The Workers' Party, together with some pacifists and civil libertarians and a few other socialists, resisted these attacks on democratic freedoms. Shachtman called on the government to give substance to its propaganda by giving democratic rights to African Americans. Quote, American quote, democracy, end quote, stinks with the odor of the slave market, end quote, Shachtman said. The party put forward democratic slogans with special relevance to the war: the right to vote at 18, parenthesis, over 40 years before the right was won, end parenthesis, the people's right to vote on any declaration of war, open diplomacy, a people's army, guaranteed jobs for ex-soldiers, unions, grievance committees, and civil rights for soldiers. It focused its organizing efforts among working people in the unions, where it saw the one force powerful enough to stop the erosion of democracy. It credited the United States, quote, vigorous, undefeated, and undemoralized labor movement, end quote, from preventing the kind of all-out crackdown on radicals that there had been during the First World War. It tried to turn the unions into the adversary of the national security state. This effort brought Shachtman's organization into direct opposition to almost all union officials. It encouraged as well as to the U.S. Army. This effort brought Shachtman's organization into direct opposition to almost all union officials it encountered, as well as to the U.S. government. He was not disturbed by this antagonism, which only confirmed the suspicious attitude he had had toward union officials since he began his radical career. Quote, taken as a whole, not this or that individual labor official, end quote. The union bureaucracy was, quote, closer to the middle class than to the working class, ... It enjoys special privileges and powers in society, end quote, which it could keep, quote, only insofar as it keeps the labor movement tied to capitalism, end quote. Shachtman and his followers in the unions urged workers to organize independently of these, quote, capitalist labor leaders, ... oppose their ideas at all times, and seek to replace them with leaders who understand what capitalism is and who know how to fight it, end quote. Against overwhelming odds, Shachtman and Shachtman's followers helped build a strong tendency in the unions in 1943 to 45 to oppose the union bureaucracy, the government, the Republicans and Democrats, and the way the war was being fought. Shachtman said later, quote, the labor movement was bent to its knees by the union leaders, but they could not prostrate it. They could not even prevent it from rising to its feet and fighting for its interest, end quote. The wartime boom helped by making workers more restive. Quote, every new announcement of growing company profits is worth 10 union organizers' speeches, end quote, Shachtman said in 1941. Wartime patriotism was not having the dampening effect he had expected. Quote, the workers' patriotism is a reluctant patriotism, cold to the beating of the war drums, ... If fascism is to be smashed because fascism means super-intensified exploitation and the oppression of labor, then the workers want none of it introduced here in the name of opposition to it, end quote. The Workers' Party began to work urgently in 1941 to muster its troops for the, quote, war at home, end quote. Even before the split from the Socialist Workers Party, Shachtman's faction demanded that young Trotskyists be sent into industry. After the split, the party was determined to push its members into industrial jobs. It ordered every eligible member to join a trade union and begin moving members out of New York and Chicago into industrial areas in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and California. Every member who was not in a factory was interviewed to find out why not, and some members who could not or would not go and forfeited their membership. Enormous pressure was put even on members who were unprepared to make, quote, the sudden disorienting leap from the lecture hall to the assembly line, end quote. Leo Seidlitz was typical of the students turned revolutionaries who enlisted in Shachtman's industrial army. Leo Seidlitz dropped out of Brooklyn College only months before his graduation. Leo Seidlitz received rudimentary training from his Young People's Socialist League friend Herman Benson on how to use a lathe. Then he started applying for jobs as a skilled machinist. The first jobs he was hired for he was fired from before he had finished his first day, but he kept coming back, kept learning, and eventually he was a machinist. He remained a machinist for 2 years until he was drafted. The Workers' Party was too weak to do much in the first show of wartime labor militancy. The 1941 strike wave, in which the CIO organized Ford Motors and Bethlehem Steel and more workers went out on strike than in any year since 1919, a temporary fall in the level of labor activism in 1941 to 42 gave the party more time to prepare. In April 1941, United Auto Workers leaders insisted on mediation to avoid a strike at General Motors. In June, United Auto Workers leaders and the government crushed a communist-led strike at North American Aviation in California, as labor action mocked, quote, the army in action against strikers, end quote. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union a few days later, communists called off every strike they could in order to spur war production. The government restrained the Socialist Workers Party's resistance by sending 18 of its leaders to jail in 1943 for advocating revolution. The AFL, which stuck to an attitude of trade unionism, as usual longer than the CIO, finally knuckled after Pearl Harbor and made its own no-strike pledge. The day after Pearl Harbor, strikes were called off around the country. At first, the Workers' Party's efforts to put down roots and make trouble in industry were set back by the war, since many of the 150 party members drafted into the military were its best-placed industrial workers. But in the end, its determination paid off. By the last 2 years of the war, it had replaced its drafted members with women and younger men and pushed even more members into industry. More members with jobs meant more money for the party. Quote, when the war started, most of us had been unemployed for a long time. We'd learned to live with no money at all, end quote. San Francisco Railroad worker and Workers' Party leader Gordon Haskell explained later, quote, now we all had industrial jobs and we felt as rich as Croesus. We had guys giving a week's payout of a month without feeling it, end quote. This flow of riches helped the Workers' Party turn labor action into a popular newspaper for, and sometimes by, workers. From a circulation of only 4,000 to 4,500 in 1941, the paper's press run grew to 40,000 by 1943. 5,000 copies of each issue were distributed in Detroit alone. The new factory activists were finally able to ride the tide as the interrupted 1941 strike wave came flowing back in 1943. The Workers' Party played an outstanding leadership role in the United Auto Workers. Strangely enough, the party had not mentioned the auto industry as a focus in 1940. It decided to move people to Detroit only in March 1941 and assembled half a dozen activists there only in the summer of 1942. But by 1943, Workers' Party members were entrenched in several locals. Besides a central concentration of about 50 in Detroit, the party had strong influence over the Brewster Aeronautical Corporation local in Long Island City, New York, whose June 1944 sit-down strike set a radical example and whose aeronautes spread a radical message across the Union. The Workers' Party established a network of sympathizers who shared its socialism and even its opposition to the war. The Workers' Party recruited some black as well as white unionists, in keeping with the insistence of its founding convention. Although most African American recruits stayed in the party only a few months before drifting away, the few that stayed sufficed to make the Workers' Party a bridge between white and black workers. Ernest McKinney worked with African American steel workers and auto workers in Buffalo, for example, urging them to take part and fight for equality in their unions. Shachtman's speeches in Detroit would draw 40 or 50 African American trade unionists. The spirits of interracial solidarity in the auto plants, which radicals had benefited from and encouraged, showed its strength during the race riots that swept Detroit during 1943, as whites attacked African Americans who had moved north to work in the factories. Although, quote, there was race against race in the streets, end quote, Leo Seidlitz remembered, and entire blocks were being surrounded by whites or African Americans, there was, quote, not a single racial incident inside a factory plant, end quote. Shachtman's insistence on seeing blacks as workers rather than as distinct people showed its most positive side here. Workers were being drawn together by discontent with the wartime no-strike pledge. Once workers got over their initial bliss at wartime full employment, the squeeze on their stagnant wages by skyrocketing prices frustrated them. The cruelest expression of the price workers paid for the war was the government's so-called Little Steel formula. This formula was imposed on July 1942, limited wages to 15% above their levels of the 1st of January 1941, thus backdating the war by a year to erase the gains of the 1941 strike wave. The AFL and CIO acquiesced in this formula in return for a maintenance of membership agreement that increased their ranks and dues without putting them to the trouble of organizing anyone. Quote, they sold labor's most powerful weapon, the right to strike, and didn't even get a mess of pottage for it, end quote, Shachtman said. Inflation, higher taxes, forced war loans, and elimination of premium pay all ate away at frozen wages. Despite the fact that by November 1943 the Little Steel formula was virtually a dead letter, thanks to a united mine workers' victory after a 12-month strike battle, real wages rose only 5% during the wartime boom. Net profits of major corporations, on the other hand, rose 107% in 1939 to 42 alone. Through 1943, the United Auto Workers members went out on wildcat strikes more and more often, despite union officials' resistance and the government's willingness to draft strikers into the army as punishment. Entire locals began to call for repudiations of the no-strike pledge. But neither of the two factions fighting to control the United Auto Workers backed the demand. One, led by George Addis, the Union's secretary-treasurer, was supported by the communists. He usually controlled the Union. The other faction, led by Walter Reuther, head of the Union's General Motors Department, was supported by socialists, capital S socialists. It was often a strong opposition. Reuther would be the pole star around which Shachtman's perspective on labor would revolve for years to come. The son of a German immigrant, socialist brewery worker, and labor organizer, Reuther went to college in Detroit, but returned to the auto plant as an organizer in the mid-1930s. I believe I'm pronouncing this guy's name right. His father probably would have pronounced his name Reuter. TH is usually T in German, but I'm imagining that Americans called him Reuther. Reuther acquired a certain radical aura when he joined the Socialist Workers Party in 1932, although he left the Reuther acquired a certain radical aura when he joined the Socialist Party in 1932, although Reuther left the Socialist Party in 1938. Reuther made a name for himself in the war's early months by Reuther's patriotism, coming up with a plan to turn out 500 planes a day and calling on workers for, quote, equality of sacrifice, end quote, and later in the war by Reuther's attempts to turn workers' grievances into support for his fight against Addis. In 1943, for instance, Reuther helped beat back a plan by Addis and the communists for, quote, incentive pay, end quote, parenthesis, piecework, end parenthesis. In October 1943, the United Auto Workers Convention reaffirmed the no-strike pledge despite its members' unrest. Shachtman blamed the communists, a, quote, fifth column, the most conscious, best organized, and most dangerous right wing in the labor movement today, end quote, for the convention defeat. But Shachtman also blamed the, quote, fence-sitting and double talk, end quote, of people like Reuther. Shachtman complained that the real militants were not organized separately from Reuther's faction and urged, quote, organization now, exclamation point, end quote. The Workers' Party stood at the center of a growing opposition network. In July 1944, the party's contacts came together to form a rank-and-file caucus, united around a three-plank platform, rescind the no-strike pledge, form an independent labor party, and elect a new union leadership. The challenge from the rank-and-file caucus came to a head at the union's convention in Grand Rapids in September 1944. a convention remembered afterwards as the high point of the Workers' Party wartime prestige in the unions. Reuther tried to square the circle at this convention, win support from radicals opposed to the no-strike pledge, without challenging the government. Reuther put forward a compromise proposal: rescind the no-strike pledge only for those plants completely unrelated to war production, and only after Germany was defeated. The overwhelming defeat of his middle position gave Reuther the greatest humiliation of his union career. One delegate said that the Reuther position was, quote, full of splinters you get from sitting on top of fence, end quote. Perhaps 100 delegates out of 2,300 voted for it, while hooting resounded in the hall. The rank and file caucus's straightforward repudiation of the pledge got over 36% of the vote. Rank and filers rounded up wounded veterans of their own to counter wounded veterans that the leadership threatened to bring in. They waved tiny U.S. flags whenever a leadership speaker indulged in rhetorical flag waving. Shachtman proposed that the rank-and-file caucus refuse any compromise with Reuther's half-hearted position. Other caucus members followed Shachtman's lead. This independent stance paid off. The caucus succeeded in defeating the Addis leadership's proposal to reaffirm the no-strike pledge on the convention floor and won the right to a membership referendum on the issue. Quote, the militants were organized, openly and consciously, for the first time, end quote. Shachtman crowed in the New International. They had, quote, a program of their own for the first time, ... They no longer trailed along, exasperated but helpless behind the Reuther group, end quote. They overcame communist appeals to, quote, the Great New Deal on which our union was founded, lie, end parenthesis, on which it was built, lie, end parenthesis, to which we owe our advances, lie, end parenthesis, on which we depend for our future, lie, end parenthesis, end quote. The rank-and-file caucus went all out to win the referendum, pointing out 3 issues of a special paper, the rank-and-filer, in the winter of 1944-45. The results were paradoxical. In a referendum in which only a fraction of union members voted, 2/3 of those voting upheld the no-strike pledge in February 1945. Yet the pledge barely passed in the union's Michigan strongholds, Detroit, Flint, Lansing, despite wording on the ballot that argued for voting yes, and procedures that may have allowed many company executives to vote. Furthermore, many more union members than voted for the pledge in the referendum violated it in practice by going out on strike in 1944 and 1945. Around the country, there were more strikes in 1944 than in any other year in this century. There were far more strikes overall during the less than 4 years of the war, December 1941 through August 1945, that during the fabled years of the CIO, 1936 to 1939, union members may not have had the political self-confidence or trust in elections to vote against the pledge, but neither did they let patriotism interfere with their going out on strike. The fights to build and defend this militancy hardened Shachtman's hostility to the Communist Party. In 1940, Jim Cannon defended Trotskyist practice of allying with, quote, even the conservative labor fakers against the Stalinists, end quote, because communists were willing to disrupt a union at Stalin's orders while ordinary union officials tended, quote, from self-interest, end quote, to be, quote, a little more loyal to the unions, end quote. Cannon even argued for, quote, purging the labor movement of the curse of Stalinism, ... by the conscious democratic action of the ranks, end quote. Shachtman and his party held this same attitude in the early 1940s, but in a remarkably balanced way. The Workers' Party wanted to eliminate communist influence in the unions, but it rejected any alliance with, quote, reactionary and red-baiting elements to do it. Shachtman warned in July 1940 that the government was persecuting the communists, quote, the most unpopular group, the better later to smash the whole working class movement, end quote. The Workers' Party was willing to work openly hand in hand, quote, with the Communist Party as a party, end quote. Wartime battles with the Communists pushed Shachtman and his party toward a stance of more rigid hostility. Communists would do anything to keep war production going, including trying to ban labor action from plants, informing to the boss on troublemakers, and getting them fired from their jobs. The idea of working, quote, hand in hand, end quote, with communists was obviously impossible, and Shachtman stopped mentioning the possibility. Communists wanted, quote, the same strangled, blinded, gagged, and fettered labor movement here that their Moscow overlords have established in the Soviet Union, end quote. Shachtman charged in June 1942. The New International said in 1945, quote, the time is fast approaching when whoever seriously aspires to leadership in the American working class and refuses to align himself in merciless struggle against the Communist Party will thereby prove himself either a traitor or a blind fool, end quote. Shachtman's group's record in the unions also made Shachtman somewhat condescending towards the Socialist Workers Party. Cannon's followers, intimidated by the government's imprisonment of their leaders, followed a policy of, quote, caution, end quote, in the unions. Quote, and by caution, quote, and by, quote, caution, end quote, Shachtman said, quote, they meant abstention from any notable activity in the unions, end quote. Shachtman contrasted Cannon's followers in the unions with his own, who, quote, did not retire to a storm cellar for the duration, quote, until it blows over, end quote, end quote. One second. Time for a sip of coffee. Where are we at here? As the Workers' Party gained members and influence in the unions and helped lead rebellions against the no-strike pledge, Shachtman paid more attention to labor's political potential. Shachtman renewed his interest in the idea which the Workers' Party had inherited from the Socialist Workers' Party of an independent labor party. Unless the labor movement defended its pre-war victories through independent politics, the Workers' Party warned everything it had gained could be lost. Although the Labor Party movement was dormant in the early 1940s, the Workers' Party used the Labor Party slogan as a weapon against Republicans and Democrats, while giving electoral support almost exclusively to its own candidates. Shachtman himself ran for Congress in the Bronx on the Workers' Party's ticket, twice for city council and twice for mayor of New York. Each time, Shachtman got a couple of thousand votes at most, drawn largely from the South Bronx, Harlem, the Lower East Side, and Brownsville. I think Brownsville is in Brooklyn. I know that from Brooklyn's Finest by Biggie Smalls with Jay-Z. The party kept clear even of electoral cooperation with other leftist groups, parenthesis, though it endorsed Socialist Workers' Party candidates, end parenthesis. By late 1943, the Workers' Party said that with 13 million workers and unions, U.S. labor was as militant and organized as any labor movement in the world. It was bound to become a crucial political force. The party saw, quote, unmistakable signs, end quote, of interest among U.S. workers in independent politics. It resolved to encourage this interest. Shachtman thought more about Labor Party politics in the last years of the war than he ever had before. Although third parties existed in only a few parts of the country and were only in their first stage, he wanted his organization to play a part in them. Leaders of existing third parties were firmly committed to the Roosevelt administration, but Shachtman began arguing that there were ways to oppose these leaders, use them and maneuver among them in order to bring a real labor party and working class power closer. He knew that creating a labor party would mean defeating communists and the same officials he was battling in the unions. He also faced the probability that any labor party that arose any time would be controlled at first by many of those same officials. They, quote, would try to head the movement in order to head it off, end quote. He warned, quote, take the steel out of the organization and replace it with putty, end quote. He said about designing tactics for fighting inside it against them. The Workers' Party would fight for, quote, an independent labor party based on the trade unions and democratically controlled by the trade unions, end quote. It said in January 1944, but it would fight inside the Labor Party for a militant program of struggle against capitalism with the aim of making labor the, quote, ruler of the country, end quote. At first, Shachtman put forward a program to urge a hypothetical labor party that amounted to a program for socialist revolution, including forming workers' councils. But in December 1944, the Workers' Party proposed a new program, this time focusing less on workers' councils and more on demands that could get an immediate echo among the working people after the war. It called for the right to a job, a guaranteed annual wage, 2 years' pay for returning veterans, a shorter work week, a $250 billion housing program, nationalization of banks, monopolies in transport, and a big war profits tax. It made clear that these measures presupposed an independent labor government. They were, quote, the first important steps towards achievement of socialism, end quote, Shachtman said. Organizing working people to win and administer the reforms was the most important step towards socialism since, quote, by its very nature, bracket, socialism, end bracket, demands, ... constant control and direction by the people, end quote. Although a real labor party with a working class program was bound to lead towards socialism, Shachtman thought, alleged labor parties that supported Democrats or were not based on unions, like the Minnesota Farmer Labor Party and the American Labor Party of New York, would only help prop up capitalism. At first, the Workers' Party paid little attention to these parties. It said that they would be swept away in the Depression that would hit the United States after the war. The party also foresaw the rise of McCarthyism and its, quote, subtle totalitarian measures, end quote, which it detected in embryo in wartime restrictions on workers' rights to organize. In the face of democratic crisis and repression, the party anticipated a relatively fast radicalization that would create a radical labor party. There would be no opportunity for the kind of diversion La Follette had created in 1924. In November 1942, Shachtman argued that socialists should look critically even at supposedly independent American Labor Party campaigns. Even when these campaigns were ostensibly directed against both Republicans and Democrats, Shachtman said, they were often maneuvers by pro-Roosevelt Democrats against other Democrats. The American Labor Party had simply been, quote, assigned by the New Deal machine the task of ... doing its dirty work, end quote. Its candidates would deserve support only when they encouraged working people to oppose the whole Democratic Party, not just one or another of its factions. By 1944, Shachtman decided that even half-hearted third parties could have an impact on the rise of a radical labor party, and he made a first attempt to push the American Labor Party in the right direction. The stage was set when the CIO created a political action committee to fight for Franklin Roosevelt's re-election and made Sidney Hillman of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, Roosevelt's closest labor ally, its chairman. Hillman worked energetically to organize labor for Roosevelt and unite all pro-Roosevelt unionists under his sway. Shachtman said that Hillman's successes showed labor's potential to transform the country's political climate. He put forward a slogan that would loom large in his thinking after the war, quote, transform the PAC into a labor party, end quote. But at the moment, Shachtman saw Hillman's work as setting back independent labor politics. Hillman succeeded in merging the Minnesota Farmer Labor Party into the Democratic Party, which until then had been a minor force in Minnesota politics. Then Hillman allied with communists to win control of the American Labor Party. There Hillman ran into opposition from David Dubinsky of the International Ladies' Garment Workers. Dubinsky supported Roosevelt just as enthusiastically as Hillman, but he had come to view the American Labor Party as his personal fiefdom. By delivering its endorsement to an occasional Republican, Dubinsky had forced Democrats to court him. He had gone so far as to run an independent candidate for governor in 1942. He opposed letting the Democrats reduce the ALP to a dependable appendage. Besides, Dubinsky had been at odds with Hillman since the ladies' garment workers had gone back to the AFL fold in 1940 and was a bitter anti-communist. Shachtman agreed with Dubinsky that communists were a menace and that the American Labor Party should be something more than an extra ballot line for Democrats. Shachtman had little use for the American Labor Party as it was, but cherished hopes that it might be transformed someday into something worthwhile. Quote, although the American Labor Party was not our party, the party of the working class, end quote, he said it was, quote, our problem, the problem of the working class, end quote. Besides, he hated to stay out of a fight. At first, he said that Dubinsky's faction, like Hillman's, deserved no support. To expect Dubinsky to form a real Labor Party was, quote, to expect a reed to stand up like a pillar, end quote. Dubinsky only wanted to salvage the LLP as a, quote, middle-class party with labor pretensions, end quote. Shachtman tried to organize a third faction around a proposal to put the American Labor Party under the democratic control of unions committed to political independence. But Shachtman's third faction never got off the ground. Instead, Shachtman urged his followers to back Dubinsky's candidates in the March 1944 primaries as the lesser evil. Dubinsky was at least making, quote, halting, tentative, but unmistakable moves, end quote, towards expanding the third party movement, he said, while Hillman was, quote, Roosevelt's direct political ward healer, end quote. Besides, the communists had to be stopped. Hillman won the primaries and Dubinsky split from the American Labor Party in June to form his own New York Liberal Party. No one in the Workers' Party whispered the thought yet of supporting the Liberals. Quote, neither the American Labor Party nor the Liberal Party is an independent Labor Party, end quote. Shachtman's independent New York mayoral campaign said in 1945, quote, they trail along with one or another of the capitalist machines, pleading with shabby politicians to select, quote, good, end quote, candidates, capitalist candidates of capitalist parties, end quote. Such a party was nothing but, quote, a miserable bargaining agency, end quote, Shachtman said. But Shachtman was thinking more and more about how these bargaining agencies could be saved for genuine labor politics. With the turn of the war's tide at the end of 1942, Shachtman's attention was drawn more and more to the battle against fascism being fought in Europe. With Germany and Italy on the defensive, he began to put forward ideas about how European revolutionaries should fight against German and Italian occupations. His ideas fit in with his underlying attitude toward the war, that socialists should be hostile to either side's victory, but he watched resistance movements in Europe with growing enthusiasm, seeing in them the main hope for his politics. If Marxists could become leaders in these movements, there might at last be hope for socialism in Europe. In Shachtman's eyes, the core of the anti-fascist resistance was a revolutionary third camp being born, which had to separate itself from the Allied camp that was alien to it. The resistance to German occupation was at the heart of the European strategy he advocated. It became his model for years of national liberation. It became his model for wars of national liberation. A model he would also adapt to anti-colonial revolutions in Asia. National revolutions, Shachtman decided, were the key to socialism in his time. By 1942, the German Reich stretched from the Atlantic coast of France to central Russia. Shachtman saw the, quote, slavery, end quote, the Germans imposed on the peoples they occupied as a regression to the open violence of capitalism's earliest years. It was the crudest form of capitalist, quote, wage slavery, end quote, though like the French who extracted forced labor from colonized Africans, the Germans supplemented paid labor with forced labor, especially in the occupied Soviet territories. What Britain and France had done to millions of Africans and Asians, Germany was doing to millions of Europeans. For, quote, the, quote, white man's superiority, end quote, it had substituted, quote, the still more aristocratic and more preposterous, quote, Nordic superiority, end quote. Its labor camps, mass deportations, and mass murders were signs, Shachtman said, that Europe had, quote, been hurled back, to neo-barbarism, end quote. In the summer of 1941, even before German expansion had been checked, he heard rumors of underground resistance to German occupation in France, Norway, Yugoslavia, and Poland. He urged European Trotskyists to join the resistance wherever and however it arose, taking as his model Lenin's support for the German-backed Irish Army that launched the 1916 Easter Rebellion against the British. Easter Rebellion against the British. The Irish Rebellion was a, quote, national liberation war, end quote, in which the German role was unimportant, Lenin had said. The rebels' demand for democracy implicitly threatened all the imperial powers. Most important, the Irish rebels, not the Germans, began the rebellion, controlled the rebellion, and were waging it in a revolutionary way. The Irish Rebellion alone was, quote, capable of going all the way to insurrection and street fighting, capable of breaking down the iron discipline of the army, end quote. Therefore, it was less a tragedy and a problem than an opportunity for socialists. Shachtman saw the anti-fascist movement being born in the underground as potentially the Easter Rebellion of the Second World War. Shachtman saw all other anti-fascist forces as unreliable by comparison. The Soviet Union and communists had changed sides twice already in 1939 and 1941. As for capitalist politicians in occupied Europe, many of them could live almost as easily with a Nazi victory as an Allied victory, and wanted mainly to be on the winning side. Almost any capitalist would cooperate with Germany to achieve, quote, his main aim, the protection of his capital. The protection of his capital, end quote. Shachtman said, quote, no quote, rightist allegiance was as easily lost as won. Many supporters of the pro-German Vichy government in France, quote, announced themselves as great French patriots, end quote, as soon as the Allies began winning victories in 1942 and 1943, but they could easily become German patriots again. With individual exceptions, only those in the resistance who had no commitment to capitalism could be counted on to fight the Nazis until the end. Even those who could be counted on to fight Germany could not necessarily be counted on to create a truly democratic Europe after the war. Shachtman believed that the Allied governments and the governments in exile they patronized would be half-hearted Democrats at best. Charles de Gaulle, the British-backed candidate to lead the French resistance, was not much of a Democrat. De Gaulle had chosen the Royalist Cross of Lorraine, over the Republican tricolor as his Free French emblem. Shachtman foresaw that the Allies would seize even more German territory after the Second World War and after the First, and trample on the rights of minorities, parenthesis, such as Germans in Czechoslovakia and Poland and Hungary and Yugoslavia and Romania, end parenthesis. Shachtman foresaw that they would suppress democratic movements in French, Belgian, and Dutch colonies and keep the European economy in the hands of people who had funded or collaborated with fascism. Above all, he foresaw that a Europe freed by U.S. and Soviet troops and their guerrilla, quote, auxiliaries, end quote, will be ruled from Washington and Moscow. The fundamental decisions about Europe's future would be made by U.S. and Soviet rulers, not by Europeans. This kind of Europe, a Europe of restored colonial empires and national antagonisms ruled by foreign powers, was not the Europe Shachtman hoped to see after the war. For the resistance to take aid from the Allies was acceptable and sensible, he said, but it should fight against Allied governments' attempts to control it and to impose their post-war plans. Shachtman believed that another kind of post-war Europe was possible, in which democratic freedoms were fully established, no people ruled over any other, and the working class was well positioned to fight for power. This Europe could be created only by an independent resistance with its own democratically controlled leadership. Shachtman said later that national resistance movements more than U.S. or British troops were crucial to the Nazis' defeat. Quote, Hitlerism could unite the continent only by converting the continent into a prison, end quote, he said. When the prisoners rebelled, they, quote, prevented that thorough utilization of the continent's resources by which alone Germany could hope to win the war, end quote. Nazism, quote, broke its back, end quote, in the fight with the resistance. The movement for national liberation was not unified or classless. The Workers' Party said, the movement for national liberation included, quote, every political current from native anti-Hitler fascist to revolutionary socialist, end quote. The strongest forces were Gaullist and similar nationalists, communists, and social-minded Catholics. Marxists had to take part and had to gain strength. The rebirth of their movement would be through the underground if it was to happen at all. Shachtman argued that socialist revolution in Europe would have to be ushered in by basic struggles for democracy that had already been won decades before and then lost with the rise of fascism. Socialists had to push the rock up the hill from a point even lower than where they had found it in the late 19th century, refighting battles that had already been historically outlived. The strongest levers to lift the rock were democratic and national slogans. Although European peoples had little desire for the return of their own native capitalists to power, quote, the overwhelming majority of them want first of all, the destruction of foreign fascist domination, that is, of Hitler's rule, end quote. By joining in the movement and influencing it, Marxists could achieve, quote, the linking of the aims of the national movement to the aims of socialism. The linking of the aims of the national movement to the aims of socialism, end quote. By 1943, Shachtman saw the brightest, most immediate promise for linking national liberation to socialism in Yugoslavia and Italy. He was impressed by the way Tito's Yugoslav partisans had organized their first fight against German and Italian occupation, redistributing land to the peasants, burning archives and land registries, setting up, quote, liberation committees, end quote, to replace discredited puppet governments, and swelling the partisans' ranks and authority in each stretch of territory they captured. Though, quote, Stalinist-inspired and largely Stalinist-led, end quote, the Workers' Party said, the Yugoslav movement was, quote, popular, democratic, and organizationally and programmatically fluid, end quote. An article in the New International said that Yugoslav revolutionaries should join the partisans. Shachtman said that Yugoslav communists were appealing to Yugoslavs' desire for democracy, waging a, quote, uncompromising and uncorrupted, end quote, fight against the Germans, and, quote, organizing an armed force of all the peoples of Yugoslavia, in which neither national origin nor religious belief was made the basis of discrimination, end quote. One Workers' Party member speculated that, quote, Trotskyists, end quote, rumored to be among the Yugoslav partisans were, quote, just old communist revolutionaries who refused to follow Stalin's counter-revolutionary line, end quote. Tito's strategy pitted him not only against Hitler and Mussolini, but also against Draza Mihailovich and his troops, who were loyal to the Yugoslav royal government in exile in London, and even against Stalin. In November 1943, Tito proclaimed a provisional government and renounced all loyalty to the monarchy. Shachtman responded to Tito's policy by hailing Mihailovich as the leader of Free Yugoslavia, offering Britain a 50% share of influence in post-war Yugoslavia, refusing for months to send Tito's partisans arms or ammunition, censoring Radio Free Yugoslavia, and urging Tito to accept the monarchy. While Yugoslav partisans were still fighting in the hills, a more decisive test of Shachtman's analysis came in Italy in August 1943. The approach of Allied armies to Rome provoked Benito Mussolini's fall from power and anti-fascist uprisings. Shachtman greeted the Italian events with excitement and optimism. Italians were fed up with the war and indifferent to the war's outcome, he said, and, quote, once that mood sets in, the stage is all set for a revolutionary upheaval, end quote. After 22 years of fascism, during which it had apparently crushed all opposition, it crumbled under the impact of popular anger. Quote, the upheaval in Italy will undoubtedly be written into history as the event that ushered in the second big wave of revolutions in the 20th century, end quote, he said. Quote, once more, the proletarian revolution, end bracket, even though scarred and wounded in many battles, can raise its head proudly and cry out in the ringing words of Rosa, bracket, Luxembourg, end bracket, ... I was, I am, and I shall be, end quote. But the events in Italy were not a socialist revolution, only a, quote, harbinger, end quote. Italian capitalists had acted shrewdly to prevent one. Faced with a choice of revolution from below or a, quote, revolution from above, quiet, orderly, mildly sacrificial, end quote, the bourgeoisie grabbed at revolution from above in the person of a new premier, Badoglio. The Italian working class could not, quote, simply pick up overnight where it left off when Mussolini took power, end quote, Shachtman said. Much of the pre-Mussolini revolutionary leadership had been corrupted by Stalinism, the rest decimated by fascism. Quote, the great tragedy of war politics is the tragedy of the Revolutionary Party, ... its absence at every crucial moment, ... except in the Russian crisis of November 1917, end quote. Quote, the direct struggle for socialist power is a distance off, end quote, in Italy, Shachtman concluded. By the spring of 1944, the leftist groups that had sworn to overthrow Badoglio's government joined it. Quote, when the pressure grew, these fake Democrats collapsed like a jackknife, end quote, Shachtman said. Italian communists were willing to settle for control of the Ministry of Interior, quote, police and prisons, end quote. The Allies, for their part, were glad to ornament their government of, quote, Mussolini's general, Mussolini's king, and a mob of discredited fascist gunmen, end quote, with Republicans and leftists who could more easily win popular support for the Allied war effort. Marxists had to expose this farce by fighting for democratic rights such as elections that Badoglio's government still denied, and by waging this struggle wisely and well could Marxists, quote, slide over, end quote, in the future to the fight for workers' power. The outcome of the Italian uprising made Shachtman more cautious about the prospects for revolution in Germany. Shachtman was as eager to see a German revolution as anyone, but he felt that its prospects would depend on events outside Germany. Quote, at the given moment, the key to Germany lies, ... in the Nazi-occupied countries of Europe, end quote. The Workers' Party said, supporting the resistance outside Germany was a, quote, means of stimulating, preparing, and supporting the coming revolution in Germany, end quote. As time passed, Shachtman doubted whether the German Revolution was coming at all, particularly after the failure of a general's plot to kill Hitler in July 1944. If the United States had offered the German military peace in the terms Woodrow Wilson had offered it in 1918, quote, the war would long ago have been over and the Nazi regime with it, end quote, he said. But Hitler was too barbaric to ask for an armistice as Germany had in 1918, and Roosevelt was too barbaric to offer one. The standards of capitalist civilization had declined in 25 years. Shachtman concluded that Marxists would probably not be able to lead revolutions in Europe immediately after the war, but Shachtman doubted that the Allies would be able to impose Latin American-style puppets. The Workers' Party predicted a, quote, democratic, end quote, interval, end quote. After Hitler's defeat, a period of, quote, bourgeois democracy with a strong, quote, social, end quote, tinge, end quote. Marxists would have more time to organize themselves and fight for socialist democracy, European independence, and unity. Meanwhile, Allied governments would be organizing their forces to carve Europe into spheres of influence. This prediction contradicted Trotsky's 1934 prophecy that socialist revolutions would arise from the Second World War, quote, much faster, more decisively, and relentlessly, end quote, than after the First World War. But Shachtman's thinking was compatible with Trotsky's more cautious suggestions in 1940 that Europe would face, quote, long years, if not decades, of war, uprisings, brief interludes of truce, new wars, and new uprisings, end quote. Shachtman now foresaw one of the, quote, interludes of truce, end quote, Trotsky had talked about. Quote, interlude, end quote, was a key word. The Workers' Party did not expect new capitalist democracies to last longer than the 15 years the pre-war German Weimar Republic lasted. Nor did it see these regimes as anything to support. But Marxists should fight to protect democratic freedoms during this intermission so that they could organize the, quote, crushed and atomized, end quote, working class. Under the occupation, most Europeans had little contact with any anti-fascist groups. Workers' Party leaders pointed out, before Europeans could accept anyone's leadership, they had to have a chance to get to know the different groups. This made democratic rights a crucial goal. The struggle would be all the easier since the armed forces of the resistance would survive after the war. The old owners would demand their factories back, but if the owners had collaborated with fascism, workers would call for nationalization of the factories. If the workers suspected collaboration, they would demand to see the books, and if the workers had suffered under a vicious management, they would demand a say in post-war management. Thus, quote, dual power in the factories will exist from the very first day of the, quote, national, end quote, revolution, end quote. The Workers' Party said. The experience of power in the factories and in the anti-fascist militia would give people a sense of what real democracy was like. Revolutionaries would have every opportunity to win people to the culminating demand of true democracy, the demand for, quote, the most democratic and representative institutions, the councils of workers and peasants, end quote. Even when he couched his analysis in this relatively optimistic way, Shachtman had to wage an uphill fight to convince his revolutionary followers the revolution was not around the corner. He had no way of reaching all his followers in Allied uniforms, so he had no chance to warn them that the European Revolution might be delayed. As Leo Seidlitz marched into Germany, he looked everywhere for signs of the expected German Revolution. Quote, I was convinced that the only way the war could end would be revolution, ... I saw nothing like that, ... and I thought this could go on forever, end quote. He remembered, quote, I got personally very depressed. I mean, black depression, end quote. The, quote, Johnsonites, end quote, led by C.L.R. James, parenthesis, quote, Johnson, end quote, and Raya Dunayevskaya, in Shachtman's own organization, rejected his whole analysis. Dunayevskaya and James had brought together a circle of followers, and they fought for their, quote, state capitalist, end quote, theory of the Soviet Union in 1940 to 41. They grew more hostile to Shachtman in the next few years. James, quote, held court, end quote, at the house of a New York architect who supported him politically and financially. Johnsonites were set off from the rest of the Workers' Party by their conviction that working people showed in everyday life their readiness for revolution. This conviction led them to take an interest in comics, jazz, and popular culture. James Dunayevskaya and other Johnsonites studied Hegel together. The group had a, quote, cliquish quality, end quote. Johnsonite supporter Steve Zellock said later, quote, there was one person who had laid down the law. Quote, there was one person and he laid down the law, end quote. James became convinced that even without big revolutionary parties, the revolutionary tide would be irresistible. In October 1943, James predicted that the European Revolution would come in a, quote, year, or, end quote, or a, quote, few months, end quote. The Socialist Workers Party said that big revolutionary parties were necessary but could be formed and take power in Europe, quote, in a very short time. Quote, another long period of bourgeois democracy, end quote, was ruled out. By mid-1943, a group critical of Cannon's approach and sympathetic to Shachtman's formed in the Socialist Workers Party, led by Al Goldman and Felix Morrow, a New Yorker about Shachtman's age who had joined the Trotskyists in 1934. Similar debates took place throughout the Fourth International. In fact, thousands of miles from the fighting, Shachtman had arrived at a strategy similar to the one improvised by Europeans such as Belgian Trotskyist Ernest Mandel. His main divergence from most European Trotskyists was his insistence that Marxists were unlikely to be in a position to fight for power immediately after the war. The last months of the war showed that even Shachtman had been too optimistic about post-war revolutionary prospects in Europe. As Allied armies marched south into France and north into Italy in 1944-45, working-class resistance fighters turned their guns over to the victors and their factories over to the old owners of the communists and social democrats' urging, far more docilely than Shachtman had imagined. Kept quiet by their leaders' urgings and by caution in the face of U.S. and British troops, European workers were also kept in line by gratitude and hunger. France, quote, must come crawling to Washington for food, end quote, Shachtman realized. The United States had, quote, the bludgeons of food and capital for, quote, reconstruction, end quote, in each hand and a stockpile of atomic weapons at its back, end quote. The New International denounced the, quote, cold-blooded use of the most generous sentiments of the American people, the expenditure of their strength and blood of their sons, the ballyhoo about liberating Europe for freedom and democracy, and now this, end quote. Quote, the wreckage and prostration of Europe are almost beyond our imagination, end quote. Shachtman reported on his return from a visit there, quote, you see things that turn you weak with horror, end quote. He spoke of London's East End dock area, quote, razed to bracket the ground, end bracket, seared, twisted, ghostly, end quote. And the French town of Caen, which is spelled C-A-E-N, that's my guess at pronunciation, in Normandy, consisting of, quote, scattered piles of rubble, stone, brick, timber, grotesque bits of furniture, as if the city had been struck repeatedly by some colossal white-hot sledgehammer, end quote. The sight of the wreckage reinforced his conviction that capitalism had to be destroyed before it could spawn another war. He saw the atomic bomb as the, quote, symbol of capitalism in its death throes, end quote, and of what capitalism's survival would do to humanity. But Shachtman saw no immediate prospect of socialist revolution because there was no leadership in place to lead one. Shachtman returned more convinced than ever that Marxists had to do more than criticize parliamentary democracy in the name of an ideal democracy of workers' councils, as they had done after the First War, when workers' councils actually existed in many European countries. Instead, Marxists had to find more modest goals to rally popular support, goals that would highlight the inadequacy of the new European regimes, even by ordinary democratic standards. They had to identify themselves with the democratic aspirations that people were expressing. Europeans would resist U.S. support for right-wing undemocratic forces, quote, because resistance is the condition for life, end quote, Shachtman said in September 1945. The Fourth International had to focus on demands such as adoption of democratic constitutions, nationalizations under workers' control, and immediate independence for colonies, for Greece, Italy, Belgium, and Holland, abolishing the monarchy and setting up a democratic republic headed Shachtman's agenda, quote, for a unified and independent Germany, end quote, and unilateral U.S. withdrawal to bring it about were other key slogans. By rallying people behind these democratic demands, Marxists could gather the forces to create a more thoroughgoing socialist democracy. The forces mobilized in Western Europe to resist fascism, in fact, helped create a relatively democratic and progressive post-war Europe. Thanks to them, Italy became a republic. At least some of the industrialists who had collaborated had their companies nationalized, strong welfare states were established, but the anti-democratic tendencies Shachtman had feared from an Allied victory were also real. They appeared most nakedly in Greece, where Britain and the United States opposed a repressive right-wing regime by violently suppressing resistance forces, and the Spanish and Portuguese dictatorships that the United States tolerated and aided. U.S. and British occupation authorities never finished, quote, denazifying, end quote, West Germany or Austria because anti-communism became a higher priority. Even the most democratic Western European countries largely gave up control of their armies to a U.S.-dominated joint command and control of their economies to U.S.-aid administrators. Several of them waged long atrocity-ridden wars against colonial peoples in Indonesia, Malaya, Vietnam, and Algeria. Shachtman recognized in the mid-1940s that many workers were supporting social democrats who were aiding U.S. efforts to control Europe and supporting the colonial wars. Despite their non-too-democratic actions, social democrats were capitalizing on Europeans' enthusiasm at regaining, quote, their own, end quote, democratic institutions. Communists were winning support with democratic and anti-capitalist slogans that were equally hollow. Shachtman said that revolutionary Marxists had to find ways to expose and outflank these inconsistent, even hypocritical Democrats in the first instance by pushing them toward action, unity, and the fight for power. Shachtman's attitude toward communist parties in Western Europe in 1946 and 1947 was founded on his conviction that the Soviet rulers who gave them their orders were afraid of confrontation with the United States and of uncontrolled social revolution. In Western Europe, therefore, he saw communists as reformists of a kind, not as, quote, totalitarian parties in the traditional sense, end quote. He did not expect them to fight for power. In late 1946, the Workers' Party dismissed the idea of a Stalinist Spain, for example, as a, quote, political impossibility, end quote. Footnote. Herman Benson and Jack Widick tried to get the party to say in so many words that communists outside the USSR did not, quote, represent any new class in society, end quote, and could never come to power without direct Soviet backing. Though not formally endorsed, Benson and Widick's assumptions were reflected in the 1946-47 Workers' Party decisions. End footnote. Shachtman also continued to say in 1946, as in 1941, over objections from Joe Carter, Hal Draper, and Manny Geltman, that if there was an attempt to restore capitalism by force from within the Soviet Union, Marxists should side with Stalinists against capitalist forces. Quote, the differences that we had, I have to this day, end quote. Shachtman said. Shachtman was so confident that Stalinist regimes were not a threat in Western Europe that Shachtman was willing to try to push communists into government. In January 1946, the Workers' Party called for a government in France that would unite the Socialist Party, Communist Party, and communist-led trade unions. In this call, the party subordinated its anti-Stalinism to the need it saw to have the French working class stop playing the game of, quote, national unity, end quote, that was keeping capitalism going in France. Shachtman believed that it was crucial to encourage radicalizing workers, even under social democratic and communist leaders, to break with Charles de Gaulle, the Christian Democrats, the U.S. power behind him, and the U.S. power behind them. In May 1947, when the Communist Party was thrown out of the French coalition government, Shachtman commented that the move clearly showed the U.S. government's hand. Quote, our slogan of Communist Party, Socialist Party government is confirmed all over, in my opinion, end quote, he said. Even as communists sent their supporters out on strike and into the streets against the French government, he remained calm. The communists were only trying to get back into the coalition by showing that they could, quote, guarantee disorder, end quote, as well as, quote, guarantee order, end quote, he said. Since communists would not actually win the power, the constant disorder they were creating would only lose them support. As late as December 1947, Labor Action urged support for communist-led strikes in order to push aside communist leadership and pose a real challenge to the French regime. Shachtman had no confidence in socialist or communist leaders. Although nobody could stop them from creating a socialist France if they mobilized their supporters, he said, they would mobilize no one without a, quote, tidal wave of working-class pressure, end quote. The Workers' Party said that a call for a socialist communist government had to be combined with demands for nationalization of basic industry, a democratic constitution, replacement of Allied occupation forces with a popular militia, and independence for French colonies. It also warned against the communist threat to democratic freedoms. It opposed the raising the communists to power or any share of it as if there was, quote, a clear threat of its use of the state police for the extermination of the independent working class and revolutionary movements, end quote. But it saw no such threat. The only possible means of seizing power, quote, Soviets, factory committees, workers' militias, would constitute a mortal danger, not only to the Stalinist party but to the Russian Empire, end quote. Although Shachtman downplayed the danger of Stalinism in Western Europe after the Second World War, Shachtman was very much alive to the danger in Eastern Europe. As U.S. and British troops moved eastward into Germany and northward into Italy and Greece in 1944-45, the Soviet army moved westward. Stalin had kept a firm grip on power through the defeats of 1941 and 1942. Stalin consolidated his power through victory. By the summer of 1944, the Soviet army defeated the Germans at Minsk in Belorussia, reached the pre-war frontiers of Poland, and moved southward into the Balkans. Shachtman and almost everyone else had underestimated the Soviet Union's military staying power. Quote, the worldwide total casualties of the United States since it entered the war hardly compared with what Russia loses in a few weeks, end quote, he said. In the last months of the war, Stalin's regime began to collect the dividends of Soviet people's sacrifices. It imposed Soviet domination on Eastern Europe. The events in Eastern Europe posed a challenge to existing theories of Stalinism. Before the war, Shachtman and other Trotskyists had seen Stalinism as a distortion arising from the overthrow of capitalism in one isolated backward country. They had upheld Trotsky's theory that Stalinism could only oppose and undermine revolutions, not lead them. They interpreted the theory to mean that Stalin's regime could not continue to rule a non-capitalist Soviet Union for much longer, much less overthrow capitalism anywhere else. The theory was the basis for the foundation of the Fourth International, the force that would have to overthrow capitalism on an international scale because of the default of Social Democrats and Stalinists. The first crack in this theory came with the Soviet occupation in 1939-40 of eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and eastern Finland. Trotskyists saw that Stalinism was capable, after all, of eliminating capitalism outside the Soviet Union. They propped up the theory of Stalinism's counter-revolutionary nature by saying that Stalinism's international policy as a whole in 1939-40 was as counter-revolutionary as ever, because the international working class lost more through the strengthening of fascism than it gained through the loss to capitalism of a small part of Eastern Europe. Shachtman was distinguished by his insistence that even the destruction of capitalism in newly acquired Soviet territories was no advance for socialism. Overturning capitalism by bureaucratic fiat to consolidate bureaucratic power, he said, did nothing to help working people win power for themselves and create a system that would serve their interest. Therefore, it did nothing for socialism. Shachtman was as well equipped as any other social theorist to understand Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe, but to consolidate his mature understanding of Stalinist expansion, Shachtman had to abandon the notion that the Soviet bureaucracy was merely an untrustworthy guardian of collectivist property. He had toyed in 1939 with the idea that the Soviet rulers had not wanted to nationalize industry in eastern Poland. As late as May 1943, he suggested that far from shrinking the capitalist-dominated area of Europe, the Soviet alliance with the United States and Britain could lead to a restoration of capitalism in the USSR. But by July 1943, he had said he had laid that suggestion to rest. Far from undermining collectivist property, the Soviet bureaucracy, quote, draws its sustenance and power from it, end quote, he said. He inched closer to the position Joe Carter had argued against him in 1940-41, that there was nothing worth defending in the Soviet Union, including the nationalized industry. Quote, every trace of the great revolutionary promise of 1917 has literally been wiped out, end quote, Shachtman said. Quote, if the rule of Stalin continues, it will make no difference to the masses whether Russia is victorious in the war or is defeated, end quote. He renounced the idea that he had put forward in 1941 of defending the Soviet state if its British and U.S. allies were defeated and if it faced Nazi Germany alone. Shachtman's analysis enabled him in late 1943 to make an accurate prediction about the future of Eastern Europe and to account for the policies of most of the world's communist parties across national variations and sudden shifts of line. Shachtman predicted that communists would not take power by leading revolutions. They would take power where Soviet troops could give it to them and the Soviet bureaucracy could control them. He foresaw the communist parties in Eastern Europe would become instruments for the imposition of Stalinist societies there, while Western European communists would help capitalism survive. As early as March 1942, Shachtman said that Soviet victory in the war would spread a, quote, new slavery, end quote, westward into Europe to the limits of Stalin's 1939-40 annexations and beyond. In February 1943, immediately after the Soviet victory at Stalingrad, the Workers' Party predicted that after the war, the USSR would try to make Eastern Europe its, quote, imperialist stamping ground, end quote. The party warned that wherever communists took power, they would kill the real Marxists and destroy independent working-class organizations, as they had in the USSR and Catalonia, but it did not try to predict what kind of societies communists might install in Eastern Europe. It did not rule out Stalinism's evolution into some kind of capitalist dictatorship. In October and November 1943, Shachtman amplified, quote, Stalin aims to place all the countries east of Germany under the domination of the Kremlin, end quote. For the first time, he predicted that capitalist property would be expropriated in Poland, Finland, Bulgaria, Romania, much if not all of Yugoslavia and northwestern China. Parenthesis, he suggested that Stalin might settle for, quote, vassal states, end quote, instead in some places, depending on deals that the USSR might make with the United States and Britain, end parenthesis. Shachtman predicted that the Soviet Union would loot Germany, especially the sophisticated German machine tool industry, to make up for Soviet wartime losses. These predictions might be explained as a simple extrapolation from the position of armies in Europe, though they contradicted not only the repeated declaration of the world's communist parties, but also the contemporary wisdom of Western observers, all of whom knew the military position. In any event, no one duplicated the sweeping generalization Shachtman made, going beyond the specifics of Eastern Europe. Quote, where the Stalinist bureaucracy does not dominate the working class and the labor movement, be it by persuasion or by violence, and where an attempt to overturn capitalism ... would promptly bring reprisals against Russia by strong capitalist powers in a position to execute them, and especially where geographical remoteness makes the physical control of the country by Moscow extremely difficult. In such countries, the Russian bureaucracy would works to prop up capitalist rule, bracket above all, end bracket, if a genuinely socialist revolution threatens, bracket otherwise, end bracket, the bureaucracy tolerates neither the rule nor the existence of the capitalist class, Democrats and fascists included, such countries, ... it seeks to annex and subjugate, end quote. Shachtman's theory made possible two different lines of attack on communist policy. The communists were obstructing social revolution in the West and carrying out social revolution, the wrong revolution, in the East. For Marxists in the United States, Britain, and France, it legitimized an aggressive revolutionary policy by showing why the danger of creating new Stalinisms there was minimal. For Marxists in countries close to Soviet borders and Soviet troops, it legitimized all-out resistance to communist rule by showing that to the extent communists were overthrowing capitalism, they were replacing capitalism with an equally unjust order. In December 1944, with the Soviet army approaching Warsaw, Warsaw tried to free itself by revolting against the Germans. The Soviet army stayed put on the other side of the Vistula and allowed the Germans to suppress the uprising. Stalin threw, quote, his main enemy, the organized Warsaw proletariat, ... into the jaws of the German army, end quote, Shachtman said, and ensured that, quote, no vote, free or unfree, will alter the fate of Poland, end quote. In March 1945, he pointed out that the Soviet Union had taken Germany's place as the dominant European power. Soon, Eastern European peoples were living under Soviet occupation. They had been, quote, disenfranchised in the interest of Stalinist slavery, end quote. The Workers' Party said, quote, the revolutionist loses title to his name who does not protest and fight against this enslavement, end quote. By 1946, Shachtman saw the destruction of capitalism that he had predicted in Eastern Europe already in progress. The Workers' Party did not oppose the nationalizations in Eastern Europe. The Workers' Party called for the, quote, preservation of nationalized economy under democratic control, end quote. But Shachtman expected the Soviet Union to install a collectivized economy in Eastern Europe without giving any aid to the working class or socialism, just as it had in 1939-40. Shachtman called for resistance to this collectivism from above in the name of collectivism from below. The Polish working class was the, quote, only worthy and reliable banner bearer, end quote, of resistance to Stalinism in Poland, he said. The nominal leaders of independent Poland who had spent the war in London were, quote, a gang of landowners, feudal barons, capitalist and militaristic thugs, end quote. Shachtman hoped that Eastern European opposition to Soviet conquest would grow into full-scale, successful revolution. Hitler had broken his neck in his struggle with national liberation movements. Why not Stalin? Quote, what Stalin looks upon as a garland of oak leaves around his Caesarean brow, end quote, Shachtman said, making the wish father to the thought, quote, will prove to be a noose around his criminal's throat, end quote. Shachtman. Soviet expansion finally settled for Shachtman the issue of defending the Soviet Union in war, even with the whole capitalist world arrayed against it. Foreseeing a war in which the Soviet Union would fight alone against the United States, both to resist U.S. expansion and to safeguard Soviet expansion, he decided that he could defend neither one against the other. He ruled out defending the USSR in any international war he could foresee. In April 1946, the Workers' Party said flatly, quote, we are against the defense of the Stalinist state, end quote, though it would not, quote, lay claim to a position which applies forever and under all conceivable circumstances, end quote. Seeing the, quote, peace-loving nations, ... sharpening their claws to get at each other's throats, end quote. Shachtman decided that fighting for peace meant opposing them all. coffee break. All right, back to business. In the first months after Pearl Harbor, any sign of an Asian third camp was overwhelmed by the rapid Japanese advance and U.S. attempts to stop it. In order to make a third camp's emergence possible, Shachtman was convinced that Marxists had to safeguard their independence from the United States government. No movement of resistance against Japan took orders from the United States or Britain. Took orders from the United States or Britain could be considered a genuine national liberation movement, he said. Middle-class Asian nationalists would side with U.S. or British or Japanese armies 100 times before they would resort to the desperate expedient of supporting a peasant or popular army which posed a threat to their own interests. Only where Allied forces were absent and an independent leadership present was a real liberation movement against Japan possible. Shachtman applied this logic in his analysis of popular movements in China, India, Vietnam, and Indonesia. By 1945, he saw that the war had shaken European colonial empires to their foundations. Asians would never accept European domination tamely again. He used the spread of revolution in Asia to extend the theory of national liberation that he had developed for Europe. He saw Asian liberation movements as challenges to U.S. world power, which he believed was the main force behind the dying empires. He saw forces such as the Chinese Kuomintang, by contrast, as accomplices of European and U.S. power in Asia. Trotskyists had supported the Chiang Kai-shek's army since 1937 in its defensive war against the Japanese, and the Workers' Party had continued supporting China in 1940-41. But Shachtman was mindful of the statement by the Fourth International Congress in 1938 that Trotskyists would not support U.S. or British intervention on China's side. The Congress had warned that Japan's defeat by the United States and Britain, as opposed to an indigenous Chinese force, would mean the, quote, enslavement of China by Anglo-American capital, end quote. Like most Chinese Trotskyists, the Workers' Party ended its support for Chiang's war as soon as the United States declared war on Japan in December 1941. After Pearl Harbor, Chinese airfields were directly controlled by the United States. Chinese troops were shanghaied into the British battle for control of Burma. Quote, the American General Sitwell, as head of the Chinese General Staff, symbolized the decisive subordination of China's struggle to the interest and exigencies of the imperialist war between Washington and Tokyo, end quote, Shachtman said. Chiang's subservience to the United States and his retreat of passivity in the face of Japanese attacks were of a piece. In the context of U.S.-Japanese war, Shachtman said, quote, a genuine struggle for national independence demands such an arousing and mobilizing of the masses, end quote, that Chiang's government would itself be threatened. Shachtman advised Chinese people who wanted to throw out foreign occupiers to, quote, remove the main obstacle in the road of that fight, Chiang, end quote. There was one Chinese leader who followed Shachtman's advice, though Shachtman never acknowledged the fact. Mao Zedong, though he paid lip service to Stalin's calls for unity against Japan and not only accepted Chiang's authority during the war, preserved an independent communist base in Yan'an and an independent communist army. Mao disobeyed orders from both Chiang and Stalin to commit his army to full-scale battles against the Japanese, where it would have been destroyed. Instead, it fought a war of position with the Japanese that made possible the consolidation and expansion of its revolutionary base. The Chinese Communist Party even clashed with Chiang's U.S. and Soviet-backed forces. Soon after the war ended, Mao's army put an end to Chiang's rule and U.S. power in China. The tactics Shachtman urged on Indian Marxists were more complicated because the popular movement against British rule that flared up sporadically during the war, particularly during the time of greatest Japanese threat in 1942, accepted the leadership of the Indian Congress Party. The Congress controlled the movement with considerable skill. It flirted with the Japanese in order to improve its bargaining position with the British. It used the popular movement as a bargaining chip with its colonial masters. It rushed to claim leadership of the movement, which it had done little to organize, in order to make sure that the protests did not become too radical. But what no major Congress leader did, Shachtman said, was, quote, make the categorical demand, withdraw the military forces and military rule of Britain, end quote. He would have supported any movement that did fight for the British withdrawal, particularly if Mohandas Gandhi had fought the British, quote, with a little money and some rifles, end quote, from Japan. But instead, just as Shachtman would have expected, the arrest of the Congress leaders saved them from responsibility for, quote, the millions who promptly responded to the mealy-mouthed and half-hearted Congress call for, quote, non-cooperation, end quote, end quote. While Indian leaders were trying to avoid head-on confrontation with Britain and hoping to make a deal that would free their country, Allied troops in North Africa were showing the real Allied attitude toward colonialism. Backed by U.S. and British invading force, French troops in Morocco suppressed a revolt in the mountains of Rif. The revolt bolstered Shachtman's case against U.S., quote, war for freedom, end quote. Quote, just who is it that is to be freed in Morocco, Algiers, and Tunisia, end quote, Shachtman asked, quote, the Moroccans, the Algerians, the Tunisians, not on your life, end quote. Far from giving independence to North Africa, Allied victories would make necessary another decade of colonial warfare in the 1950s and early 1960s before the French would be expelled. As the Second World War neared its end, Shachtman looked with growing interest toward Indonesia, where nationalists had been granted independence by the defeated Japanese in 1945 and were unwilling to return to Dutch rule, and Vietnam, where the Viet Minh had fought the Japanese and were ready to fight the returning French. Both countries had long histories of resistance to colonialism. Indonesian communists had led an uprising against the Dutch in 1926. Vietnamese communists had led their first uprising against the French in 1930-31. After the uprisings, the two countries' histories had diverged. Nationalists under Sukarno had replaced communists as the main anti-Dutch force in Indonesia, while communists and Trotskyists had kept the leadership of the Vietnamese movement. Sukarno had cooperated with the Japanese throughout the war, even helping to recruit, quote, voluntary, end quote, Indonesian labor for Japanese military projects. Ho Chi Minh and his followers had formed the Viet Minh to fight the Japanese in 1941. In 1945, the two histories seemed to converge again. Sukarno joined with the anti-Japanese underground and the rebelling Japanese armed guerrillas to proclaim the Republic of Indonesia. General strikes in Hanoi, Hue, and Saigon led to the creation of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam under a communist nationalist government, despite Stalin's refusal for several years to recognize it. Communists in both countries tried to arrive at a negotiated settlement with their former colonial masters. The Allies used peace talks to gain time as Chinese and British troops occupied Vietnam and British and Australian troops occupied Indonesia. Soon these surrogates had played out their roles and turned the territories they had occupied over to the Dutch and the French, who began military offensives against the new republics. Shachtman was enthusiastic about the Indonesian and Vietnamese revolutions. Shachtman called them, quote, the struggles of the Third Camp to emerge during the war free from compromising entanglements in one of the other imperialist camp, end quote. Now the United States had become their main enemy. Quote, it is with planes built in Los Angeles and tanks built in Detroit that the Anglo-Dutch reconquered Java and the Anglo-French reconquered Indochina, end quote, he said. Quote, the, quote, arsenal of democracy, end quote, emerges in its real role, the arsenal of world reaction, end quote. Even though the Viet Minh killed Vietnamese Trotskyists when they briefly held Saigon in 1945, the Workers' Party picketed French consulates in January 1947 to show solidarity with Vietnam's, quote, heroic struggle, end quote. Shachtman saw that the new U.S. empire would try to keep Asians from attaining true independence, just as the old European empires had. Even if the United States cut its support for Dutch and French colonialism and the old colonial systems crumbled, Asia was threatened with a new kind of subjugation. Asia foresaw that formal independence for Asia might mean only the kind of sham independence that Latin American countries had, with governments manipulated from Washington instead of appointed from Amsterdam to Paris. From Amsterdam or Paris, end quote. There's no quote, sorry. He foresaw that formal independence for Asia might mean only the kind of sham independence that Latin American countries had, with governments manipulated from Washington instead of appointed from Amsterdam or Paris. Quote, the United States counts on its stupendous economic power to take all these countries in tow, end quote, Shachtman warned. Shachtman emphasized the need for Marxists to become part of Asian liberation movements because, before they could think about leading them, an attitude that the early Communist International had also taken, Lenin had supported Turkish nationalists under Kemal Ataturk who were fighting against an alliance of Britain, France, Italy, and Greece that wanted to carve up their country, even though Turkish nationalists persecuted and killed communists. Communist leader Karl Radek had told Turkish communists, quote, protest against the persecution, but understand, ... you still have a long road to travel in the company of the bourgeois revolutionaries, end quote. In the same spirit, Shachtman supported the existing leadership of the Indonesian and Vietnamese revolutions, despite the repression these leaders used against democratic socialists. If you're interested in that bit on Turkey, I highly recommend Lauren Goldner's piece on Turkey from his book, Revolution, Defeat, and Theoretical Underdevelopment, I believe is the title of the book on Turkey. I can't remember what the piece is called, but I think it's something to the effect of like something about Turkey. It's either like counter-revolutionary anti-imperialism before Stalin or socialism in one country before Stalin. Something like that. Indonesian nationalists led by Sukarno persisted in relying on U.S. pressure to reach a settlement with the Dutch, despite U.S. aid to Dutch forces that were occupying more and more of the country, setting up puppet regional governments and unleashing terror against civilians. Sukarno's prime minister, Weir, said that it was crucial not to, quote, earn the enmity of capitalism, end quote. The Indonesian government conciliated capitalist opinion in March 1946 by suppressing independent communists led by Tan Malaka, who were demanding confiscation of Dutch property and complete Dutch withdrawal before negotiations, and in January 1948 by dropping Moscow-aligned communists from the government. But the Workers' Party justified Indonesians, quote, seeking to play off American imperialism against its rivals, end quote. Shachtman was similarly generous in evaluating the Vietnamese independence movement. He knew that Viet Minh leader Ho Chi Minh was a communist, but he would not say that Ho's prominence meant, quote, Stalinist leadership of the movement, end quote. Shachtman and his followers remained sympathetic to the Viet Minh, even as communists consolidated their hold over it, with the murder of Trotskyist leaders in the South in 1945 and the departure of middle-class nationalists from the rebel government soon afterwards. In March 1947, Labor Action said that in the absence of Soviet troops, Ho, quote, can maintain his leadership only as long as he represents, in some way at least, the strivings of the people for independence, end quote. Again, I would, for reference to that particular episode in 20th century communist history, I would recommend the readings that I have on this channel from the Vietnamese Trotskyist council communist No Van in his book In the Crossfire, Reflections of a Vietnamese Revolutionary. Back to the text. Where am I? The allowances Shachtman made for Asian nationalists in the mid-1940s did not imply abandonment of socialist revolution as his goal for Asia. Experience with the Chinese Kuomintang had shown that the strategy of supporting revolutionary nationalists could be disastrous unless communists kept to an independent policy and were prepared to organize on their own to defend revolutionary gains in their own lives. Shachtman kept the Chinese experience in mind. Shachtman was convinced that the vast majority of people in Asia, who then as now were living in rural poverty, could be freed to live better lives only by socialism. Quote, only the socialist road can liberate the peasant from the centuries-old curse of what Marx harshly called, quote, rural idiocy, end quote. It liberates him by completely abolishing his status as peasant, ... It converts him into a free producer on the land, which has been reorganized on a modern, mechanized, large-scale cooperative basis. This is possible only when large-scale industry is developed to the point where it not only dominates overwhelmingly the entire country, but where the productivity of labor is higher than it has ever been in any capitalist country, and is therefore in a position to produce the comforts as well as the needs of life in abundance for all to enjoy. This in turn is conceivable only after the victory of the proletariat in several advanced capitalist countries. End quote. Asian liberation movements were therefore bound up in Shachtman's mind with socialist movements in Western Europe and North America. In the mid-1940s, when Shachtman still believed that socialist breakthroughs were possible in Europe, Shachtman saw revolutions in Asia as jolts that could start events in Europe moving. Colonial independence was an invariable item of the democratic program that he counted on to raise socialists to power in Europe. He saw revolution in Europe in turn as the Asian revolution's best hope for victory. The emergence of a transformed post-war world prompted Shachtman to take another look at issues of socialist organization, particularly at his own Workers' Party. Instead of seeing his group as the party destined to lead the revolution, he began in 1945-46 to take a longer view. With no socialist revolution on the U.S. horizon, Shachtman saw the need for a long process in which a real revolutionary party would be built by stages. The party that Shachtman saw as the outcome of this process would be more diverse than any existing group on the left. It would be a, quote, all-inclusive revolutionary party, end quote. Shachtman wrestled with the heterogeneous party's need for a hard inner core, a, quote, cadre, end quote, that could make it strong and effective in action as well as pluralist in composition. Shachtman's model was, if not a departure from the Bolshevik tradition, a development of it, even an innovation within it. Quote, is the Workers' Party really a party? ... The answer is an emphatic, quote, no, end quote. Exclamation point, end quote. Shachtman said in 1945, quote, in calling ourselves the Workers' Party, we did no more than proclaim our intention to become a party, end quote. A party has to be able to mobilize thousands of people for action when it needs to, he explained. The Workers' Party had nowhere near enough members or influence yet to act as the leader of thousands. If it tried, it would either attempt initiatives beyond its strength, which no one would follow, or end up discarding its revolutionary ideas in order to give itself the illusion of leading thousands. New mass parties arise very rarely, and never in the space of a single decade, Shachtman pointed out. Quote, in our time, mass parties, generally speaking, came out of mass parties, end quote. No new mass parties have been built from scratch in the advanced capitalist countries since before the First World War. The communist parties became mass parties only through splits within big social democratic parties. In the United States, the mass socialist party that was emerging before the First World War was derailed by wartime and post-war repression and splits. Quote, we are handicapped primarily by the fact that we do not operate within a politically organized working class. This is point A, B, C, and all other letters down to Z, end quote. Shachtman said, building an independent labor party and building a revolutionary party were closely intertwined projects. A mass revolutionary party would come only, quote, at the end of a road of fusions and splits and regroupments into a big movement, end quote. Shachtman still hoped that his followers would play a decisive role in the bigger movement, but his newfound modesty about his group contrasted strikingly with the Socialist Workers' Party, which proclaimed in 1946, quote, the Revolutionary Vanguard Party, ... already exists and its name is the Socialist Workers' Party, end quote. The Workers' Party instead began to see itself not as, the Workers' Party began to not see the Workers' Party self as the party, but as one effort to help build a broader party. Shachtman began referring to his goal as the, quote, all-inclusive revolutionary party, end quote. This heretical-sounding phrase borrowed the term, quote, all-inclusive, end quote, from Norman Thomas's Socialist Party of the mid-1930s, a party whose, quote, all-inclusiveness, end quote, had been part and parcel of its reformist shapelessness. But Shachtman made the paradox seem workable. Shachtman wanted an all-inclusive party in the, quote, revolutionary Marxist sense, end quote, not in Thomas's sense, he said. A multi-tendency party, all of whose tendencies would be revolutionary and Marxist. Looking back, Shachtman saw the Bolshevik Party of 1917 as just this kind of party. In the process of building a broad revolutionary party, the Workers' Party had to go through the stages of, quote, propaganda group, end quote, a group gathering an initial core of members around its complete program, and, quote, agitational group, end quote, a group translating its ideas into short-term slogans for existing movements. The Workers' Party had moved beyond being a mere propaganda group during the war, Shachtman said, because it came out of the Socialist Workers Party's already, quote, trained and educated, end quote, foresaw the workers would be open to radical action and ideas during the war and followed up its analysis with hard work. It was held back from consolidating itself as an activist group for two reasons. First, the existence of the Socialist Workers' Party. To quote, even the average radical worker, the two parties look and sound and feel pretty much alike, at least at first blush, end quote, Shachtman admitted. The Workers' Party was forced into endless explanations to justify its existence, which got in the way of a more activist approach. Shachtman continued to advocate reunification of the two groups as the solution to this problem. Second, the Workers' Party had not integrated the Workers' Party's new recruits. Instead of spending enormous amounts of time, quote, straightening out the last hair, end quote, in our position, end quote, older members needed to train recruits in basic Marxism. Shachtman complained about, quote, smarter, end quote, old-timers who continually dropped remarks like, quote, you know, of course, about the laws which drove to the dissolution of the slave economy in the days of the Roman Empire, end quote. The result of the thorough training of the best recruits and the retraining and recommitment of older members would be the creation of a strong, unified, quote, cadre, end quote, of the Workers' Party. In its usual meaning, the group's, quote, cadre, end quote, was just its most experienced and most active members who worked hardest to build it. Shachtman called the group's cadre its, quote, spinal column, end quote. Quote, the cadre is not a fixed and certainly not, it's not a faction and certainly not a clique, ... Being part of the cadre does not bring anyone immunity from failure to discharge party responsibilities or special rewards for discharging them. It does, ... It does mean being part and parcel of the leadership of the party, ... The local leadership does not allow any center to say, quote, leading the party is exclusively our business, end quote. The center, in turn, allows no local leader to speak and act as if to say, quote, leading the party is not my responsibility. Let, quote, them, end quote, take that load, end quote. Shachtman argued that not every experienced and active member necessarily qualified as a cadre. Shachtman's definition limited the cadre to those who, without trying, quote, to deprive critics and opponents, ... of their right to criticize and oppose, end quote, understood and basically agreed with the group's program. The cadre was, quote, the propagandist and defender of the party program within the ranks of the party itself, end quote. Shachtman said that his narrow conception was unavoidable precisely because the Workers' Party was so broad. Quote, it is precisely the inclusive revolutionary party that cannot have an inclusive cadre, end quote. He said, CLR James, for example, had moved closer to Cannon's politics on one issue after another since the war, until he disagreed with most of Shachtman's followers more than he agreed with them. Shachtman insisted that there was still a place for James in the Workers' Party, but if James chose to spend more time arguing about the group's program than putting it into practice, then James was not part of its cadre. Shachtman worried that some of his older followers showed signs of, quote, losing their nerve, end quote, due to the strain they had been under during the war, which was, quote, trivial compared with what we must yet endure in the future, end quote. Quote, they're not standing up as well as they should under our enforced isolation, end quote, he said. Quote, in isolation to which we are condemned for the next period, even if we had twice and 4 times our membership and a 10-fold improvement in our activity, end quote. Too many of these older members were neglecting their responsibilities. Too many were searching, quote, for some magic formula that will save us all, end quote. In an essay on Trotsky's unfinished biography of Stalin, Shachtman implicitly suggested that a would-be revolutionary cadre could even learn some things from Stalin. There would be admirable things about... In an essay on Trotsky's unfinished biography of Stalin, Shachtman implicitly suggested that a would-be revolutionary cadre could even learn some things from Stalin. There were admirable things about Stalin, Shachtman said, qualities that won him respect in the Bolsheviks' hardest years from 1907 to 1912. Quote, Stalin was one of the not too many who did not flinch and did not quit, end quote, who, quote, continued without perturbation to risk his life and freedom, end quote. Stalin, quote, discharged well the tasks, imbuing others with tenacity, with contempt for the deserters, end quote. Quote, with all things properly arranged, end quote, Shachtman concluded, quote, the Zinovievs and Stalins and all their first-class second-raters also find their place in the leadership and enriches its capacities, end quote. The Workers' Party was suffering from a shortage of selfless secondary leaders. In this respect, Cannon's organization seemed to have an edge over Shachtman's. This idea of learning something from seems like a very dubious thing to say about Shachtman. I've read this essay and it's going on the channel. The idea that that Stalin was like a reliable doer in the Bolshevik Party is not some kind of special softness that Shachtman has for Stalin or something like that, which I feel like this paragraph definitely would suggest, as if this is somehow some kind of I don't know. This is definitely suggesting that Shachtman had some softness or for Stalin at something, but this is a very common analysis of Stalin's role in pre-1917 Bolshevism as a reliable doer, a reliable and a risk taker, especially in his role as a bank robber for the party. I think that this kind of suggestion that it's we need more faceless executors is without you don't question things too much, is I don't know. It's not something Shachtman was about. Shachtman's modesty about his organization had its limits. Even if the Workers' Party was not the revolutionary party, the Workers' Party did represent a, quote, clear-cut political tendency in the working class, ... recognized and known as such in all informed political circles. I think the emphasis should be in informed. He said, end quote, he said. It was a, quote, centralized Marxist organization in which the widest and freest discussion is not only, quote, tolerated but encouraged, end quote. Shachtman still said that it was, quote, the truest link with the great past of Marxism, end quote. The end. Next chapter is titled... The next chapter is chapter 6, Between Reformism and Barbarism. Thanks for listening.